Hey there everybody, it's Alex here from VG247.com, and I'm just here with some quick impressions, as quick as I can make them, of the Guardians of the Galaxy game, which of course is the latest Marvel game coming from Square Enix, and coming from Eidos Montreal, which is of course the studio that is most famous for the rebooted Deus Ex games, which are brilliant. So, before we start, I want to talk just quickly about the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? I think it falls into two separate camps. For my money, there's the really distinct films where a director makes a mark, and then there's the ones that are just like run-of-the-mill popcorn flicks, and they probably get a bit of an easy ride from audiences because the audiences are invested in the wider universe. Or to put it another way, there's like Guardians of the Galaxy, and there's Black Widow. They're the two sides of the MCU. But sometimes a film is sort of in the middle, so like Black Panther, I think that is a fabulous film. And I think Ryan Coogler really created something special. But, on the other hand, it's full of all these uninspired action scenes. I think the climax of the movie sucks. It's almost like a film of two halves. One half of it lacks the flair of the rest of the film. And we talk about that because I think the new Guardians of the Galaxy game is a bit like that. So, Eidos Montreal is exceptionally good at world building. You know, 2011's Deus Ex Human Revolution, they re-envisioned a classic gaming universe with just brilliant clarity. And the sequel wasn't quite as good, but I don't really blame the studio for that, because it was clearly rushed. And that means I hold them in high regard, and the good news about Guardians of the Galaxy is all that sort of world-building excellence is on display. So in the demo I played, it was a few chapters into the game, and it kicks off with the Guardians on board their ship, the Milano. And the developers have sort of kicked back against the Mass Effect comparisons and said it isn't an RPG, it's definitely just an action-adventure game, but when you're on the ship, it's hard not to get those Mass Effect vibe. You've got characters to talk to, a workbench to upgrade, conversations with dialogue options, and just the mood. Obviously, there's Guardians touches, like there's a jukebox that's full of 80s hits, and you can set that to play as you explore the ship, and I even had one of the Guardians comment them on my choice of music as I walk past them, and that's cool. Conversations that you have, they feel a little bit like they're an evolution of Deus Ex, and also it's hard to avoid those BioWare comparisons, like I say, but they also lay the groundwork for a story that gives us a really different Guardians crew in a really different place between the films or comics. So sure enough, they do look a lot like the Guardians we know and love, but it's definitely a different version of the team. Also, there's some subtle choices that sort of drive home the differences. I mean, my favourite one is, it feels like, even though there's always that push and pull, especially between him and Rocket, this version of Peter Quill, of Star-Lord, is far more the leader of the team. And there's a subtle difference in the cockpit where, like, in the films, for instance, they sort of sit 2 by 2, equal in the cockpit. In the game, Quill sits at the back of the cockpit with the others in front of him, almost like a Star Trek captain's seat. And I think that says a lot about who he is and what his role is, and the player's role is in this team. So in terms of the mission I played in this demo, I went to a Nova Corps base, and throughout the mission you're given a number of dialogue options while playing as Star-Lord, and these not only impact what the Guardians are thinking and feeling, but they'll also alter the flow of the mission. Again, it feels a little like Deus Ex, so if you take a cavalier attitude, you might alert the bad guys to your presence sooner, and that might not only result in more combat encounters, but might also annoy the other Guardians. This isn't a game that's going to have massive different endings, but it is a game that's going to have a lot of choice in the middle of the story, so it's sort of like a reverse hourglass structure. During this preview, due to the format, I could see the screens of other players participating, and it was plain to see how different some of the paths that some of them were taking was to the one that I was taking, and that's cool to see because it seems like there'll be stuff worth replaying. And this is what I'm getting at. This is the side of Guardians where it feels like Eidos Montreal has left its mark. Like, there's little slivers of Deus Ex DNA that I love right through this game. There's great environmental storytelling and a strong sense of artistic direction. But also, on the flip side, it's things like the rough-looking choice-based dialogue scenes that Deus Ex had, where everything is in reverse shot with quite rudimentary animation. That's still there too. You definitely have a division between the cutscenes that have dynamic camera angles and look more cinematic, and these dialogue scenes where everything is a bit more flat. The other side of this is what I was talking about with Black Panther, right? So that's a film with vision that gives way to sort of boilerplate action scenes that were probably knocked up in previs without the director even being present. And Guardians world builds and then tosses you into combat that is just sort of fine. It's not underwhelming, but nor is it particularly thrilling or overwhelming. I'm just sort of whelmed. which isn't a word, at least not in this context, but I'm making it one. It's early days, obviously. I only had access to limited skills, but the basic setup is simple. You play as Peter Quill and you have access to Star-Lord's powers, so his blasters, and those blasters can fire standard damage or elemental shots, plus you've got his fists, plus you've got his rocket boots. And when you're playing as Star-Lord, there are flashes of brilliance in this third-person action. Like, my favourite is the utility of the jet boots for, like, dodging back and forth, going into a slide, shooting from a slide. The visceral sort of buzz, you know, as good now as it was in Vanquish, you know. And you know it's decent if I get to name-check Vanquish. But in other places, I'm a little colder on the whole thing. There's a stagger bar mechanic, which is a bit like Final Fantasy 13 and 7 Remake, where what you want to do is use certain moves to put enemies into a staggered state by dealing staggering damage, and then when they're in staggered state, that's when you can just lay down the real damage. And this can be satisfying or it can feel flat, and it seems to just depend on the moment. So like using the ice elemental shot from Star-Lord blasters to like freeze an enemy, then use that freeze time to stagger them and then deliver devastating blows, it works. But way too often in this hands-on, I felt like I was pumping attacks into enemies with health bars that depleted really slowly. And when you combine that with Star-Lord's rocketing around and hovering and stuff, it began to feel a little bit like, and I'm sorry for this, Anthem. When you're controlling Star-Lord, the other Guardians do their own thing. They're like AI companions. They've each got an AI that suits their personality, which is cool. So Gamora will like single out enemies while Drax will go and fight big groups. You can trigger special moves for each of them by pressing a button, and that sort of, they have cooldowns on those, and so you choose when to trigger those, and some of those are really useful. So like Groot has a move where he can lock an enemy down with his roots, which for me in this hands-on was a really indispensable bit of crowd control when there were a lot of enemies around. There's also environmental stuff that you can trigger, so you can get the order a Guardian to sort of pick up a barrel and throw it, and it's an explosive barrel, or drop something on enemies, things like that. So that's an element of it. And there's also like team-up attacks and Arkham-style finishing moves. There's a hell of a lot here. It's a dense combat, although I can't say any of it really gave me that spark of where I just really loved it, and that's what I look for when I'm in a preview. The thing is, the combat's really chaotic, and you've got to focus on controlling Star-Lord because he's quite squishy, and so sometimes it can be really hectic and really difficult to even get a Guardian to attack the right enemy at the right time while keeping track of everything else going on. Now, a preview like this throws you into the game several chapters deep without the tutorials that will have explained and gently ramped up the complexity, and so I think this will come off better in the final game. But regardless, it's a very chaotic and intense combat system, and I've got the fear that it might be trying to do a few too many things at once. With that said, my favourite piece of the combat is the huddle system, which draws a bit of American football-style playmaking into matters. So, like with the captain's chair, Star-Lord is the leader, and in combat you can call the Guardians together for a huddle. The action stops, and you basically talk to them, and the choices you make, we're back to dialogue choices, will determine what buff you get, how good the buff you get is, if it's just a buff for Star-Lord, or if everybody gets a buff if you say the right thing. Do you notice a pattern, though? Everything that's grabbing me about this game is narrative-based. Like, forget the fact that these aren't the film Guardians. They're distinct, and I'm already enjoying spending time with them. I'm intrigued by their unique past history and what might be for them in the future. But once I actually started playing the game, I was like, this is fine, but it's not blowing my mind. And I guess that matches up to much of the cinematic universe too, right? There's the rough with the smooth. Black Widow was worth sitting through for fun character moments, even though I began to tune out as soon as the action started. And I'm hoping that with Guardians, the bits I love outweigh the bits I don't in the same sort of way. This hands-on seems to suggest it will, but we'll find out in full in October, and you can stick with us by reading the site vg247.com, subscribing, ringing the bell. We'll have more on Guardians and all the other big games this year.
Hey, thanks for watching this video. Consider subscribing if you enjoyed it. It's free and you can always unsubscribe at any time. Take a look at our other videos if you like. Also, check out vg247.com for around the clock gaming news and updates.